Thank you, Bob. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening, buenas noches. I led the establishment of our Caribbean Initiative with the intention of carving out a space in US and global policy to increase awareness to the challenges facing the Caribbean. Because of the nature of Caribbean economies, most leaders rely on all international institutions and allies around the world to secure access to goods and services for their citizens. Most Caribbean leaders refer to this as pragmatic foreign policy. In many ways, I share this vision with the region's leadership, and that is reflected in the pragmatic nature of the Caribbean Initiative. This approach has grown in importance because our hemisphere is faced with three major issues: the three C's: climate change, COVID-19, and conflict. Climate change does not have boundaries. It continues to produce stronger and more frequent hurricanes, such as the one that stormed through Mexico last week. It will take global teamwork to help mitigate its effects. The pandemic also transcended borders, and it took global efforts to get vaccines to the region. India, the African Union, the EU, Canada, China, and of course, the United States are among the countries that helped the Caribbean. And the recent invasion of Ukraine has seen food and energy prices soar, putting so many in the Americas at the mercy of global market volatility. All three C's, in varying moments, have battered Latin American and Caribbean economies and citizens alike. These challenges, while having a disproportionate effect on some, impact the lives of everyone in the hemisphere, regardless of economic size or ideological affinities. No geographic border can contain rising sea levels or the next pandemic, and no border mitigated the global consequences from the war in Ukraine. But a fourth C has started to creep into discussions, policies, and legislation geared towards the region. This C is choice, one in particular that is forced potentially to take sides. While the implications of it might not be apparent at first, it can, in the long term, have devastating economic effects. As is the topic of tonight's dinner, these challenges can only be tackled effectively and equitably by working together. And in doing so, also allowing flexibility for countries in the hemisphere to welcome bilateral assistance from others around the world. The prosperity and security of Latin America and the Caribbean in the decades to come hinges on the opportunity to have and not eliminate choice in its direction. It is also time that we usher in another C, one that is often spoken of but has challenges to implement: cooperation. Cooperation as a mechanism that accounts for differences among us, but emphasizes the commonalities that we share. Cooperation as a platform that sees US attention to the region become more consistent through policies that achieve sustainable impact for the common person. Cooperation to see tangible solutions to the daunting challenges facing our hemisphere as an opportunity to work with all potential partners for the betterment of the region's future. So tonight, following the conclusion of the 9th Summit of the Americas, it is my hope that our conversations will help us to advance new cooperative mechanisms that prepare this hemisphere to stand up to the challenges of today and tomorrow. For our next conversation, I'm honored to introduce the Most Honorable Prime Minister, Andrew Holness from Jamaica. Prime Minister Holness, in office for over 6 years, is widely recognized as one of the Caribbean's premier leaders. He's the youngest person in Jamaica's history to be elected and re-elected as Prime Minister, and has distinguished himself throughout his career as a leader on issues of education. His policies have helped Jamaica through turbulent times due to the pandemic and hurricanes. Welcome, Prime Minister. I'll now hand it over to Jason.
It's a real pleasure to be with you, Mr. Prime Minister. I want to start off by asking about your opinion on the key takeaways. From your perspective, what do you see as the main accomplishments from the summit? And also, what are those main accomplishments, especially with regard to U.S.-Caribbean relations and moving forward in that regard?
Firstly, I would say that the summit process was a success. I would also say that I've been to many such summits and conferences. I think this one distinguished itself by virtue of the frank exchanges between the leaders, and especially between the United States and the various leaders of the region. I think the level of exchange was at a very frank level, and I think that would help the outcomes. I think for the United States, it would have signaled a very important shift in how the region views the United States. And I'm a Caribbean person, so I'm speaking mostly from a Caribbean perspective, but it may also be the perspective from the rest of Latin America. I believe President Biden was able to assure the leaders of his genuine interest in the region, and I think that's
fantastic.
important.
Yes.
I think most leaders would have come away being very impressed by the willingness of the United States to listen. It's forward-leaning in terms of wanting to hear what the problems are, and really good suggestions and policy initiatives were announced. Now, as to whether or not we will see the tangible outcomes from these, we'll wait patiently, and we will continue to engage and participate to get the results. But I think as far as summits and conferences go and the dialogue has gone, I would say it's a success.
You mentioned the importance of the frankness of those discussions among leaders. It's a really excellent point. Talk a little bit further about why you see those frank discussions as being so pivotal to addressing and moving forward the relationship across the hemisphere with the U.S., but also with the Caribbean and other countries across the region.
Well, I noticed on your map there that the Caribbean is effectively left off.
Oh gosh, I had.
Well, for my friends from Cuba, but it demonstrates a part of the challenge, right? For the U.S.,
I think that was an image from another place. I will tell you that image was not created by the Atlantic Council for sure.
No, but I think for the U.S., I mean, the U.S. spends a lot of attention in the Caribbean on Cuba, and that's a historical relationship and one that really needs attention. But I think the rest of the Caribbean feels that we're not being paid the attention that we should get, considering ourselves, as was described by a former president, as being the third border of the United States. And that has really transcended decades and many leaders, a sense of neglect. And Caribbean leaders have always been trying to reach out to the United States to say, pay some attention to the region, and for good reason. The region has significant resources. We have been a net exporter of talent and skills to the United States for a very long time. For example, Jamaica's population is approximately 3 million people. We have more than 1 million Jamaicans living here. Mm-hmm. And we have certain vulnerabilities, and particularly vulnerabilities over which we have no control or did not create. So the issues of climate change have really brought those vulnerabilities into focus. The cost to the Caribbean whenever there is a weather event, hurricane, storm, flooding, the destruction in infrastructure, and then the cost to repair So we're constantly in a cycle of recovering from disasters that are essentially generated by climate change issues. But I think, aside from climate change, that obviously is an existential threat, there are some other issues that we face in the region. The President of Ecuador, when you ask him the question, what keeps him up at night, he says, well, you know, the drug trafficking, the crime and violence. Clearly within the region, Caribbean and in Latin America, the issue of violence and crime, and in particular, the illegal trafficking of light arms and small weapons is a major problem.
Yes.
It should be of concern that this region has the highest murder rate per 100,000 of all other regions in the world, including war-torn areas. And that's something that it's within our gift, I think, within our resources to address.
And, you know, Prime Minister, the reason we started the Caribbean Initiative at the Atlantic Council was precisely for the reasons you outlined, right? That there is a lack of concerted attention to the Caribbean and a lack of recognition overall about the importance. I think that's beginning to change. I think it was important to have Vice President Harris and President Biden meet with Caribbean leaders this week, and hopefully this additional attention. You were in Washington. We saw each other there
yes.
A couple of months ago. Hopefully this attention to the Caribbean is not just the attention to the lead up to the summit, but it's a change in how we approach the Caribbean.
But the Caribbean is also could be a very important example for the rest of the world. You know, Jamaica is one of the oldest democracies in the world. We're one of the oldest 25 democracies in the world. And the region, generally, almost all the countries there are democratic countries. The challenge is that we embrace democratic principles and ideals. We are examples of strong democracies, and strong, not just, you know, we're liberal democracies. But we have not been able to convert the democratic principles into prosperity for our people. So there is still a high level of poverty in the region. And I think for the Caribbean, it's a very easy prospect with, you know, limited redirection of resources to make the institutions of democracy deliver prosperity and become an example to the rest of the world.
Financial inclusion is part of that, if you would agree, and that's been a long time a priority of our Caribbean.
Well, if you look at it in the context of what I've just said, I mean, you know, we're small economies, and we're too small to be cared for. In other words, you know, financial inclusion is important. Big banks are saying we have to de-risk. You know, you're too small to take a risk on. So what will happen to us? But wouldn't it be, you know, in the benefit of everyone if the region were given consideration?
Yeah. Well, that's
to be included in the financial system in a consistent and secure way.
You know, I think, as you know, you have a great supporters of the Atlantic Council, and that's been one of our top priorities since we began our Caribbean initiative. And we were personally very pleased to see Chairwoman Maxine Waters send a letter to President Biden.
She's been a strong advocate for us. Strong advocate.
And she specifically asked for de-risking and financial inclusion to be included into the summit's agenda. The Américas Partnership for Economic Prosperity that was announced this week. How do you see that as helping to advance inclusion in Jamaica and in the Caribbean?
Well, we don't have all the details of it, but we gather it will be focused on market access, human resource development, access to financing, and these are all great things. For Jamaica, human resource development in terms of training and skills, that's absolutely very important for our development. We are now experiencing a skills shortage, which could become a constraint on our growth potential. So we have to be investing heavily now in reskilling, upskilling, and in ensuring that our population gets the right level of education to be able to function in this fourth industrial revolution as we try to change our economy. So any support in that regard would be very, very useful. I'm hoping that it will also focus on nearshoring. I think it's in the interest of the United States to secure its supply chain, to secure its, its strategic assets and markets by investing more in the region. So nearshoring it's critical. We have seen, by virtue of the geopolitical issues right across the world, that any disruption could have an impact locally in the United States. We saw that with the pandemic, obviously,
yes, right.
where critical medical supplies, which could be made in the region, made elsewhere, we couldn't get. But if you had the facilities and the infrastructure here, it could be done. So it's really a matter as to how the United States is going to work and cooperate with its private sector to kind of direct them more into the region. Because this region, this hemisphere, has all the resources to supply almost all the needs of the hemisphere. So it really comes down to the political will, the proper economic strategy, and the cooperation and willingness of all the partners.
Mr. Professor, I want to ask you about the U.S.-Caribbean Partnership to Address the Climate Crisis 2030, the PAC 2030 that was announced this week as well, which seems to set a new forward-looking direction for U.S.-Caribbean relations with regard to climate adaptation and also resilience and also clean energy. How do you see that the PAC 2030, especially being one of the world's most tourism-dependent economies and also a country focused very much on your own energy transition, how do you see PAC 2030 insofar as supporting the goals of Jamaica and the Caribbean overall?
Well, I mean, still we're short on specific details, but
So we have a lot of thought to do after the summit, right? A lot more dinners like this.
One of the good things about the summit is the agreement to have working committees established to pursue many of the commitments and announcements that were made. But it's clear that the aspiration is there, the idea is there, and I'm happy that the direction is being given. So I see it as a response to what we've been calling for a very long time, that we need accessible finance. Now, it's one issue to say we have billions of dollars for climate change, but you can't access it easily, or you can only access it after a disaster event, when you're really not in a position to make meaningful use of it anyway. So I'm hoping that the PAC 2030 will be proactive. It will take an innovative and enlightened view of the issue of climate change, and it will focus on important things, such as assisting in the building of infrastructure that is resilient, and most importantly, helping countries in the region transition to green, renewable, sustainable energy options, which would relieve us. Which was, relieve us from the vagaries of hydrocarbons, which seem to be influenced by geopolitical events, of which we have no control or cause.
Mr. Professor, I want to ask you a similar question I asked President Lasso. When you go back to Jamaica and you talk about what was achieved at the summit, what's your main message going to be to the Jamaican people?
Well, I'm going to say I'm hopeful. That's number one. But the Jamaican people would want to hear what is going to happen to energy prices. It's number one, because that is driving an inflationary bout through the economy. They're going to want to hear about what are we going to do about food security and food prices. No specific thing was obviously addressed for those two immediate issues. And I think, leaders throughout this hemisphere will have to engage their citizens and engage their patients and explain that what is happening is, beyond our control and not as a result of our actions. And that we're going to do as best as we can with our resources to temper the effects, these negative effects. But we're going to be working in an expedited way with our partners, and particularly with the United States, to bring to fruition some of these lovely announcements, such as the financing for climate change issues, which I'm hoping will bring greater infrastructure and energy transformation, and the Americas Partnership for Economic Recovery, which I'm hoping will see expenditure on improving our ability to deliver healthcare and the development of our human capital.
I think you have a room full of people who agree with your hopes on those announcements. I want to thank you, Mr. Prime Minister, for your leadership in the Caribbean, and to also acknowledge your excellent representative in Washington, Ambassador Marczak, for all of her tireless efforts on a day-to-day